And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. Our guest author and good friend is Father Charles P. Connor, Ph.D. The book is The Spiritual Legacy of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, published by Alba House. Great to have you here, my friend.
Great to be here, Doug. Always
with
good
Father
to see
Connor.
you.
Everybody recognizes you from the multiple series you've done here on EWTN. Do you know how many series you've actually done now?
Oh, this is about 14 years I'm coming here. Yeah, so 14 of them.
Right, pretty close to that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And now you recently had finished working on the second part of the series you were doing on Bishop Sheen, right?
Right.
Which ties into obviously the book.
There's an embarrassment of riches on Sheen, and he wrote so much. It took us 2 series to get through all the material.
And is that basic? So is there a direct connection between this particular book and that 2-part series?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, the material you will read in the book, was presented on television here on the network. So
now, when we talked about doing something on Archbishop Sheen, was that the genesis of creating the material for the series that then became the book?
The book, absolutely.
Okay, it wasn't that you were thinking of writing a book and thought it would be good for a series, or?
Well, a little bit of each, actually.
Yeah, okay.
I think a little bit of each, really. I mean, it was because he was always a great interest of mine. And so, I always thought down the road it would be a possible subject for a series.
Why were you so interested in him?
Oh, I grew up with him like we all did, back in the days of black and white television, and he was always a great inspiration to me, and he was such a priestly priest. And I think he was a man who combined so many talents so well. I mean, he had a wonderful intellect. He was a brilliant speaker. He had such a persona on television and in the pulpit, and he was just so genuinely holy. It was not a contrived holiness. He was a sincerely holy man. They wouldn't be considering his cause for sainthood now if he weren't a sincerely holy man. So,
right. I noticed
all those factors.
Speaking of New York City, because even though he was, not born there, that's not where he was raised,
Midwest,
and obviously ended up in Rochester, New York, is actually the bishop there. He's associated greatly with New York City and St. Patrick's Cathedral, St. Agnes.
Sure.
I noticed that the Archbishop of New York, who's a good friend of the network as well,
yes.
Timothy M. Dolan, wrote the preface. And did you ask him specifically to do it?
I did. I've known him for quite a while. We're fellow historians, and I've known him through the American Catholic Historical Association, and I knew him, before he went to New York.
Right.
So yes, I did ask him, and much to my surprise, one day out of the clear blue sky, I received a phone call from him telling me, "Oh, I'd be honored to do it for you." So, and then very shortly thereafter, his preface arrived in the mail. So
now he quoted somebody named John Tracy Ellis.
Yes.
Never has anyone succeeded in effectively presenting the timeless and seemingly alien truths of Catholicism to a skeptical American audience as Fulton J. Sheen. Who was John Tracy Ellis?
John Tracy, Monsignor Ellis, was really the dean of American Catholic historians. He taught at Catholic University in Washington for decades, and he's responsible for writing a tremendous amount on the history of the Church in the United States. I think probably his magnum opus was a 2-volume work that he wrote on the life of Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore.
Okay.
But he wrote on the formative years of Catholic U, and he wrote a book on American Catholicism. He really was the leading recognized expert on the history of the Church in this country.
Now you mentioned, kind of the black and white image. And obviously, we rerun Life is Worth Living, so people see
on the
those
on
the network.
Sure, yes.
But we always hear the stories, and if you read the biographies about kind of the Milton Berle story, and of course you remember Jackie Gleason, Ed Sullivan, and Archbishop Dolan makes a good point. He says these great personalities of TV of over half a century ago are now part of nostalgia, admired, yes, but seen as frozen in an era no more. Not Fulton J. Sheen. Interest in him is higher than ever. Do you think so as well?
Oh, I sure do. Yeah. No, these people were period pieces. I mean, they were entertainers in their time and so forth. But I mean, Fulton Sheen offered a timeless message of spirituality. You could have written a lot of what he wrote years before he came on the scene, or he could sit down and write it today to be just as equally valid. Few people could write as well as him, I think. But I mean, that's why he kind of the message transcends time.
Right, and as you point out in this book, and as the Archbishop mentions, this is not really a biography per se.
Oh, not at all. No,
it's really a survey of his writings.
The major themes that I see emerging over 60 years.
And what you see in this is going back to the early themes, is you realize he was writing and saying these things years before he showed up on radio and TV.
Oh, indeed,
right?
He was. Absolutely. Go all the way back to his days. Well, in the 20s, really, at the University of Louvain in Belgium, he started writing, and just continued all his life.
Right. Now, you mentioned also that you see central unchanging emphasis. His emphasis on the fact that a life is empty without God, the futility of systems like Marxism and fascism, the whole problem of ignoring God. Mm-hmm. That was a big part of what he saw in the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s. Right?
Absolutely.
Now, you also mentioned later in the book something,
and really, when you think of it, Doug, I mean that's just as valid today. I mean, when Benedict XVI is talking about what does he call it? The dictatorship of relativism.
Right.
You're talking the same thing.
Right.
Same idea.
Now, also, and in chapter 9, this struck me in marriage, because as you go through the book, there's the life of all living, and then temptation and sin, and we'll talk about mystery of suffering. Those are central themes, as you say. One on marriage struck me, especially today. Archbishop Sheen wrote a great deal on the topics of marriage and courtship, love, and sexuality. It is regrettable he was unable to see the full ramifications of the sexual revolution in the 21st century, for his insights would have been tremendous. What do you think he would see or say today?
Well, I think first of all, I think he'd be deeply, deeply appreciative of the. He did live to see John Paul II elected Pope. He would be deeply appreciative of the theology of the body. Right. The last couple of years I've been studying at the John Paul Institute in Washington.
Oh, that's
right.
And
you try to immerse yourself in the, what is it? Well, it's morality presented to contemporary men and women in a somewhat different vein than Sheen would have presented it decades ago, saying the same thing, really. I mean, coming back to the same themes, but from John Paul's own unique vantage point. And I think Sheen would be enormously grateful that someone was making that much of an impact on today's world.
In fact, you referenced that as early as 1931, Sheen was critical of those who took advanced views on morality, those who felt humanity had progressed so far that a modern approach, quote unquote, was in keeping with contemporary man. So, in a lot of ways, he was a visionary.
He was, without necessarily knowing it, but yeah, indeed he was. No question.
Now, is this book just, do you think, in your mind, for Sheen fans, or do you think people who aren't really familiar with him can get a lot out of this book?
Oh, no. In fact, I mean, when you think about it, the Sheen fans are like myself, getting into an older generation now, or have gotten into it. Whereas, his message is, really the appeal of the message is not at all lost on young people today. It's quite surprising how much appeal he does have.
Speaking of
so it was written for a wide spectrum. It wasn't written just for people who remember the black and white TV
right.
days.
And for that, speaking of young people, you're now at Mount St. Mary's, right?
Yes,
at the seminary teaching.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
And it's amazing on today's seminarians how attracted they are to the spirituality of Sheen and to his books. And there's loads and loads of books to pick from. Archbishop Dolan made an interesting statement. I'm not sure whether he makes it in the foreword, but I've heard him make it a number of times. He was a student at Catholic U years ago, and he was taking a trip to the Holy Land, and he went to two different professors
I've
of
heard
Scripture.
Him say that. Right.
What book do you recommend before I go to the Holy Land? Fulton Sheen's Life of Christ.
Right.
It was quite a tribute to him.
Right. Now, speaking of him, he also said, and I thought this was interesting. I want to get your reaction. He says, it's all here. Yes, Fulton Sheen repeats a lot. Like Beethoven said, we've all only got one symphony in us. Does he repeat a lot?
Oh, he does, yes. Yeah, you can see themes, for example, from his priest retreats in the 1970s, and you can see the thematic approach was there in the 1930s also. So that if you take these 10 themes that we've talked about, they're traceable in his writings, his radio and TV, right through the decades of his priesthood, sometimes stated in different ways and sometimes even using the same phraseology over decades. Right. But it never seemed to get tiresome. Right. People appreciated it.
It transcended the age he was in at that time.
It certainly seemed to, yes.
It didn't seem dated.
It did not seem dated, that's right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, the introduction is another great friend of ours, Father Andrew Apostoli.
Father Apostoli, sure.
The connection is he's vice postulator for the cause of the canonization of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. Of course, he's done spots on that, on Fulton J. Sheen, that we've aired on.
You're on the network, yes.
The network. And he points out in the introduction here that Life is Worth Living merited him an Emmy in 1952 as the most outstanding personality on television. We referenced that before. He had a molding effect on the religious formation and education of millions of Catholics and non-Catholics as well. Why do you think he had such a great appeal to non-Catholics?
Because of his message. If you look at and examine the Life is Worth Living television series, especially in the 1950s, ran for 5 years, it was very, very much a non-sectarian kind of message. It was directed at an American public, and in that particular medium, he was by no means just speaking to the Catholics of the United States. So it was living the good life, the virtuous life, the moral life, the patriotic life, all the various virtues that anyone would agree on who would be interested in living the right way. So you see him in magazines and so forth at the time, very much on a par with people like Norman Vincent Peale and Billy Graham and these American religious leaders.
Right.
And just as respected as them, too.
Right. In fact, there's a quote about Billy Graham once referred to Bishop Sheen as the quote-unquote great communicator. And also, this is interesting, because sometimes we see people on TV and we say, well, he's a wonderful speaker and he's emotive, but who's writing his script? You know what I mean? Is he just reading it off a teleprompter? But one of the things you note in reading about Sheen, and the quote here is, he achieved some of the highest academic accomplishments by any American churchman.
He did. And, as far as what he wrote and what he spoke about, that was really born from hours and hours of meditation in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. So it was not, he often said that his writing and his speaking especially, stemmed from the many hours of prayer and meditation he put into it.
Right. Well, Father Andrew says a final quality that enriched his legacy was his obviously deep spiritual commitment to live by the very mysteries of faith he talked about. So I guess he walked the talk. And he also, this is something I thought, he uses the phrase that Bishop Sheen used, a salesman who believed in his product. Do you think some of the problems we've had to some degree in the last 30 years or so is that people were not as sure of their product?
Oh, I think that's probably true. And, I think that I think perhaps the sales advertising that we in the church did, especially, Sheen makes an interesting comment about this late in life. He did it in his autobiography. He raised the point, might it not be possible that we're not getting the number of vocations we should get to the priesthood because we're not really portraying the priesthood as it is? What is it? Well, it's a life of sacrifice. And, a priest is a priest and a victim and all this kind of thing.
But sacrifice is not on the top of most people's lists in the 60s on.
Oh, far from it, far from it.
It's not really a thing that people are signing up for.
Not at all.
He also points out, despite the impact he made in the 50s and the 60s, this is Father Andrews mentioning this, circumstances caused him to be somewhat forgotten in the years immediately after his death. But he's making a comeback. Why was he forgotten, and why is he coming back?
Well, he probably was forgotten because of the times in which he died. The times were not necessarily receptive then, in the late 70s, for an immediate perpetrating of his memory. I mean, he was just, after all, he had come from a much earlier era. And by the 1970s, we were still in that mode of the artificial post-conciliar mode, I think we will call it. Only now are we coming to see the real teaching of the Second Vatican Council, given to us by the architects Ratzinger and Wojtyła and even Balthasar, for that matter, in many, many ways. So with a deepening of an appreciation of what Vatican II was all about, and the real solidity of Vatican II, and the message Vatican II had to give to the modern world, the real message of the Council, and how solid that message was, I think you can see a blending in of Sheen's thought of years ago with where we should be today, and that's why he's being resurrected today, and with much renewed interest.
And like you said, there's 10 major themes, and Father Andrew mentions that these teachings are seen in a living movement through the journey of the Archbishop's life. So in a sense, you start with his earliest writings and move through, right, as a way of kind of, in a sense, going through his life, but seeing
one way,
how his themes early on and how
see
he
how
dealt
these
with
themes
them.
developed through his writing career.
Now, when I first saw this one, the chapter 1, The Life of All Living, I thought, oh, that's a cute title. You play on the words of, his TV show. But it's not a book he wrote.
It was the second book in the 20s. His first book was God and Intelligence in Modern Philosophy, which would be, I think, extremely deep for most readers. That was the one, by the way, G.K. Chesterton wrote the introduction to.
Right. I saw that connection there. I thought that was interesting.
But in the 20s, he wrote The Life of All Living, and you can see the switch in emphasis in him with that book, because he's trying to describe the Heavenly Father there and our relationship, our creaturely relationship with our Creator. But he tried to do it in such a way that it was very, very, very readable for every creature.
Right.
Every creature could understand the Creator.
Well, the quote right at the beginning
should be.
The quote you used right at the beginning: "How life changes its meaning when we see the love of all of the flesh as the reflection of the eternal light shot through the prism of time." Why did you decide to start with that quote?
It seemed to sum up, I think, the whole idea of where we should be, or what we should be aiming at more than anything.
Do you think we lose that sense of the eternal? We lose sense of where we're headed, or what what the world really is about?
Oh, sure. We take our creatureliness too seriously.
Kind of a short-sighted approach many times.
A short-sighted approach.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Now, elsewhere in here, this was struck me. I noticed the reference to Sheen, but he talks about the Heavenly Father, as you say, in this particular chapter. The Heavenly Father is described by Sheen as one whose first act is to think, not one thought following another, but all at once, is kind of trying to understand that. And Sheen used the example of flying over a cemetery. How did that work? What example was that? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. You could fly over a cemetery and you would see the various generations of people. I think he even used the example of one particular family, and the grandfather died in a certain year, the father died in a certain year, the son died in a certain year, and you would be looking separately at all generations, and all the human mind can take in is one particular generation at one time. Whereas God, in His infiniteness, in His infinite mind, of course, sees the totality of that. There is no time.
Right. It's all at once.
It's all
at once. Well, later in that chapter, I noticed the name that he wrote about Nietzsche, who was a name we hear about still today. And Bishop Sheen observed that Nietzsche was one who really chose to believe that God was dead in order to make room for his ego.
Primacy of the individual.
Nietzsche himself became mad. This is the part, this kind of things people should know. One day, seated at his piano, he stopped touching the keys with his fingers, began thumping them with his elbows, shouting and shrieking against the person of Christ. That's what I thought was interesting. I'd heard that he went off the deep end, and it's good to realize some of these great thinkers where they went. But I didn't realize, that he was in a sense shrieking against our Lord.
It was what it boiled down to, and I think the point he's trying to make there is all these so-called, supposedly deep philosophical reflections on the part of Nietzsche, the whole God is dead, are reflective not really of God is dead, not even of the primacy of human subjectivity, but this man's own anger. He wished things were a certain way, and he wished there were a primacy of the human, of the subjective,
And he talked about, in Sheen's mind, very typical of a century in which God had become absent from the lives of so many. Goes on to say, and his belief that hell begins here.
For those, and hell begins here because of the forgetfulness of God. I mean, when we think only in terms of the finite, only in terms of this life.
Are we still having that affect us today?
I think we are.
Yeah.
I think we are 100%. And I think that's what Benedict is trying to rally against in so much of his writings. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you quote Bishop Sheen as saying, religious belief is so essential to the heart that once it is cast aside, some false form is called in to fill the void. And that kind of relates to the quote that's at least related to Chesterton, though the actual quote is not his. Now, when you were going through this and determining what were the major themes, I mean, you picked these 10. Did you combine some? Did you discard others? And if so, how did you go about editing?
No, I didn't. I certainly don't believe that I discarded any themes that he wrote at the only one that he did write on at great length that you won't find in the book is the theme of communism. And I thought, well, that was more a period piece too, and it was he was rallying against this political subjugation, so it was more of a he argued from a spiritual point of view, but it was arguing against a political system in the world which is, well, we don't want to say non-existent, but it's minimal in comparison to what it once was some decades ago. But other than the theme of communism, which he did write and speak about tremendously, no, I think that I think you'll find there the major ones.
Things
and as far as my selection of the 10 that appear in that book, Really, it was just from my own personal reading over a lot of years and what I saw emerging. And you can, for that matter, you can take loads of his books and just very quickly look at the table of contents in each one, and you see the same ideas emerging over and over
again.
Well,
you've got the life of all living, the incarnate Son of God, temptation and sin, conversion, confession, mystery of suffering, prayer of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Our Lady always gets in there. Marriage and the Eucharist and priesthood. Now, are these in order of how he wrote about them chronologically?
No.
Or is there some reason they're in this particular order?
No particular reason. I don't. No, not at all. No.
Now, in the life of all living, he talks about Claire Booth Luce, talking about conversion. And I know when you were back on with Father Mitch, she usually comes up as the one convert most people remember.
Prominent ones.
But I didn't realize as a young woman she had lost her 18-year-old daughter in an automobile accident. And she really had no faith at all. And that's what she was
none at
about.
all. And she was referred to Sheen, I believe. Yes, I think it was by a Jesuit from Georgetown, if I recall.
And just the idea that she was kind of asking the question, well, if there is a God,
if there's a God, why did he take my daughter? And his response was something to the effect, so that you would be here now, wanting to go more deeply into the roots of personal faith.
Right.
And she did, of course.
Now, one of the other ones on a little more upbeat thing, I can't find the quote, I think must be in the conversion one, when he talks about the idea of, her and her husband. Her husband was kind of a lapsed Presbyterian, so to speak, and I don't think,
loose, yes.
Yeah, he didn't convert, right? But he was kind of saying, well, I can never really get past the point of believing that Jesus was basically a human being, and Claire Booth Luce kind of quipped, only on his mother's side.
That's right, on his mother,
something like that.
He was Jewish on his mother's side.
Well, in the chapter on conversion, writes here, Fulton Sheen wrote, conversion is an experience in no way related to the upsurge of the subconscious into the conscience. It is a gift of God. So is that gift available to everyone?
Available to everyone. And it's an interesting thing, isn't it, that people... Why does God's grace, and this is an unanswerable question really, why does God's grace so penetrate certain souls and not others? Well, I mean, if indeed it was an equal penetration of God's grace, everyone would embrace the fullness of faith, but everyone doesn't embrace the fullness of faith,
Right.
So it's a deep, deep mystery why some people respond and others do not.
Right, and you talk elsewhere in the book about Bishop Sheen dealing with that whole fact about how some respond and don't respond, and others, if the Lord already knows what's going to happen in your life, why do I have to go through life?
Why do I have to go through it?
He kind of explains that. Elsewhere, in the section on temptation and sin, you quote, in his work, The Eternal Galilean, and what is there, about 65 books or so?
In that vicinity,
Bishop Sheen likened the three temptations of Christ to the temptations offered to the modern world against the church of the 20th century, probably the 21st century too, to make religion social, political, and worldly. Such was not the lot of religion, however, nor would it be. On the contrary, its function was to bring the light of Christ to society. So is that something we're still going through, this idea of turning it to social, political, and worldly?
I think it is, for sure. But I think the Vatican Council really responded to that in Gaudium et Spes in talking about Jesus Christ being the ultimate revealer of man to himself and showing man the clear way. And that is becoming, and it's emerging more and more and more, this whole idea, this whole ecclesiology of communio that we're hearing so much about today. Mm-hmm. That's a movement away from this trend that has been there for so long, right. I think,
Right. In the section on Eucharist and the priesthood, this jumped out at me. One question Bishop Sheen treated in several of his writings on the Eucharist was why the Lord had used the accidents of bread and wine in the Eucharistic sacrifice.
Yes, and because of he goes on to explain then what they represent, the multiplicity of grains and grapes and so forth that go in, and the element of sacrifice that is entailed in the making of the accidents of bread and wine, and all very representative of what goes on in a human life. So the bread and the wine represent us in many ways, and represent our humanity in many ways, in addition to the fact that they are the elements that have traditionally been used to sustain mankind physically.
In temptation and sin, you note that saints do not find it easy to be saints, and devils are not happy being devils. Why is that important for us to know?
It's important for us to know because the life of sanctity and holiness is open to everyone, but it's a life of challenge, and it's a life where you have to keep renewing yourself day in and day out. Devils are not being happy being devils because they never renew themselves. They never challenge themselves to be anything but devils, and they're stuck there on the mire all their lives and have no particular desire to get out of it, which leads to a very, very frustrating life. It's meeting the challenge every day that's important.
Right, and the 20th century's false premise, said Sheen, was the belief that all conflicts can indeed be healed by human nature, that man has it within himself to cure his maladies simply by explaining them away.
Sure. There's the nature-grace controversy all over for you again that's been plaguing us from time immemorial.
Well, as people can tell, there's just so much in this book. We can just about scratch.
He offered us so much.
So how long did it take you actually to put this together then?
Oh, dear, I don't know, probably a year or so.
And when do you write?
Spare time when I'm not studying for exams. And
you write on the weekends, at night?
Squeeze it in whenever I have available time.
Who edits it? Do you edit yourself? Do you have somebody who you...
Generally, yeah. And then, of course, the publisher have their own. Right. They go over what I've done. But
okay, great. Another book in the works?
Not as we speak today, no, but soon, we hope,
Well, we're just out of time. Make sure you come back the next time you do have a book, okay?
I certainly will.
If not for a series or
always
one
great
of our
to
lives.
be here.
So
Thank
great to have you here.
Thank you.
The one and only Father Charles P. Connor, Ph.D., author of The Spiritual Legacy of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, published by Alba House, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. If you like Sheen, you'll like this book. Check it out on the EWTN Religious Catalog. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.